Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I'm Susan Kish, and welcome to OGCI's Talking Transition podcast. Today, we're looking at the potential for carbon capture, use, and storage, or CCS/CCUS. And my guest is one of the world's foremost experts on storing carbon dioxide, Sally Benson, who's the Precourt Family Professor at Stanford and leads the Benson Lab that focuses on geological carbon dioxide storage. Sally, good morning and welcome.
Good morning, Susan.
So let's start with the key question. Are we at an inflection point for CCUS? The technology's been around for decades. Lots of people both have been interested in it and written it off as a solution to the climate crisis. But now we're seeing lots of interest, coverage, and action. So what's magical about now?
The key difference is that about 5 years ago, the concept of net zero came along. The idea that we actually needed to eliminate all emissions. And if we're going to do that, CCUS is an absolutely critical technology. And the world's woken up to that. We see it really at the centerpiece of the discussion of a comprehensive strategy for getting to net zero. And I've been involved in this area for, more than 20 years. And I've been on all the ups and downs, the roller coaster of, carbon capture and storage. But I think there's a new earnestness. And, we all realize it's time to get going. We've got to get moving. And this is a critical piece of the technology.
So it's not just that Elon Musk did a tweet about it in early January and has a huge prize through the X Prize. That's not the only factor.
No, I mean there are policy incentives. For example, where I live, we have a low carbon fuel standard that says that if you can capture and store CO2, that is a credit that you can use to comply with that standard. We have tax credits in the United States that are getting a lot of attention. So no, it's deep and it's broad and it's wide. And finally, I mean, what's so thrilling about having Elon Musk and actually all the tech companies jumping in is it says that they're going to need this too, and that's a real shift in the narrative. It used to be, okay, gosh, we can get here with renewables and efficiency and electric cars, but when you look across the entire landscape of emissions that we need to eliminate, there are many of them that we simply don't have other options for today.
We've started to hear people talk about the need for the industry to be as big in 2050 as oil and gas is today. So is that hyperbole? Or do you think if all these elements you've just mentioned and others come together, it's actually going to become that large an industry?
Well, global modeling studies suggest that we're going to need to capture and store anywhere between 5 and 10 billion tons per year of carbon dioxide. To put that in perspective, we emit about 40 billion tons of carbon dioxide today. So anywhere from 10 to 20% of global emissions. And if you think about that, that is on the scale of the oil and gas industry today. So no, it's not hyperbole at all. Now, some of that might be captured directly from the atmosphere. We might use bioenergy plus CCS. So all of that capture and storage may not be on point sources, but in its entirety, yes, that's a very reasonable statement.
Very cool. So let me just put this in context. The Talking Transition podcast series looks at how OGCI, or the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, works. We ask questions around what the energy transition really means. We work to ask the hard and messy questions, and what are the challenges and the opportunities that this transition brings. And for OGCI, CCUS is really at the heart of that transition and a real priority for OGCI and its members. So, Sally, let's drill into this question about California, because I know you just published a study about California that was pretty widely reviewed. We've been focusing at OGCI on the creation of CCUS industrial hubs, especially in Europe, Net Zero Teesside, Northern Lights, Porthos. They're going to be ready to store millions of tons of carbon dioxide by 2025 and 26. And in the US, we've looked at hubs in Texas and Louisiana and possibly in California. So can you talk a little bit more in detail about the potential in California for a hub and for this form of carbon storage?
Sure. Yeah, happy to. Yeah, so this was a comprehensive study. It was sort of the first ever very detailed look at what is the role that carbon capture and storage could play in achieving California's goals of being net zero by 2045 or so. And we went literally point source by point source, and we identified about 60 million tons per year that could be captured and stored. That corresponds to about 15% of the carbon dioxide emissions in the state. So really important, a big number. So the next thing is we look at, well, where are all of these sources? And it turns out that they're concentrated sort of in two clusters. One in the northern part of the state, near the San Francisco Bay Area, and then the second one is in southern part of the state, around Long Beach and Los Angeles. And so when you look at the fact that they're clustered, the idea is, well, why not have a hub to create a shared infrastructure that would allow us to be much more cost effective, that you could aggregate multiple sources of carbon dioxide, and provide a whole set of basically net zero energy services. So a really important one, you mentioned ports. So ports are, of course, incredibly busy activity areas where you've got all the unloading and loading of the ships and the trucks and so forth. And one of the priorities in California and really around the world is to try to reduce the air pollution emissions associated with all these trucks, driving through neighborhoods. And one of the biggest opportunities is to use hydrogen as a source of fuel for those trucks. And it turns out that you can, make hydrogen from natural gas with a technology called steam methane reforming. And if you add carbon capture and storage, you get both the benefit of clean transportation fuel, no criteria pollutant emissions, and you can capture and store that carbon. So the idea of aggregating all of these different types of sources and getting really efficient use of that infrastructure provides us hope that we can even make this more affordable than it is today.
So that does sound like a really interesting way of looking across different problems and looking across different solutions to come up with something that actually could really make a difference. So, what are the barriers? Because are there any CCUS facilities in California right now?
No, there aren't, but there are about, four of them that I'm aware of that are in some cases in the permitting stages, and in some cases, doing sort of pre-feasibility studies. But a huge amount of interest in the state on CCS. So what's hard? I think that the number one thing that's hard is it's unfamiliar, and we don't have a regulatory structure that is fully mature, so that when it gets these permits, it can move them quickly through this whole chain. And there are many permits that you need, dozens of permits, and that always takes time. Um, I think a second thing is that we need to invest the time to work with our communities who are going to be near these facilities to make sure they're familiar and comfortable. So that takes time. There's also the issue of financing these projects. Again, if you go to get debt or equity financing, people are most comfortable when they've done 10 deals like this before, or they have colleagues that they're aware of who've done those deals. So that just hasn't happened yet. So it's just slow, I think, is one of the main reasons it's hard. And if you're a project developer, slow is hard, right? Because you want to be able to get in there and get your project done so you can start generating revenue to offset all the costs you've invested. And just one more point before I'll wrap up on this topic. In a place like California, it wasn't always clear in people's minds, I think, and the public and policymakers' mind, investors' mind, that we were going to need CCUS as part of the solution. And one of the things that would be really beneficial is for senior leaders to make it clear that we're going to need to do this if we're going to succeed in meeting our ambitious targets to eliminate emissions.
So, speaking of senior leaders and sort of audible support as one of the factors to get, whether it's the community or the investment community or the permitters or the regulators comfortable with this concept, the Biden administration is putting a lot of emphasis on infrastructure and jobs as part of their climate program. What's the role of CCUS in that concept?
Mm-hmm. Yes. So CCS projects come in sort of all different colors and sizes and so forth. So in some, you could actually do a CCS project. If you had a natural gas fired power plant and it happened to be co-located with a good geological storage resource, you could go ahead and install your capture facility, and you could drill a well so that you could pump the CO2 deep underground. So that's a relatively simple project. It's a co-location really being a key issue between the capture facility and storage resource. But there are other locations where simply you don't have a storage resource right nearby, that you need to transport that carbon dioxide to a location. It might be hundreds of miles away. It could be even farther, and in that case you're going to need pipelines. And pipelines that carry the liquefied carbon dioxide over long distances. And those are major infrastructure projects. There are right of way issues. There's all the permitting issues. So from that perspective, there's really a great deal of alignment between the Biden's infrastructure plan and the build out of CCS at scale. And there have been lots of fantastic studies looking at what would be the lowest cost pipeline network that would collect CO2 from a lot of sources, where you could aggregate it and then take it to a really ideal location to store it.
So let's continue on this question around government and policy. We see some policies playing a pivotal role, whether it's in Norway with the Norwegian government and their support for Northern Lights. But in the States, we've had regulation and policy 45Q around for quite a while. What are the other actions? You mentioned the question of permits comes up a lot, but what other actions can governments take to support and to drive these?
So, for a typical CCS project, you might be dealing with 10 different agencies who have some kind of jurisdiction over the project. So that could be, your local county agencies. It could be state level agencies like an EPA, like a state level EPA, water board, air board, all kinds of things. So there are those entities. And then there's the federal government, who also plays a role through the permitting for the underground injection permits. And for a project developer, you see all of these permits. Some of them are asking for the same information. There can be overlap, and it's pretty overwhelming to have to do this. So if the state and federal and local entities could work together to create a process where there was coordination amongst those agencies, that would be extremely beneficial. And I think ideally, even one agency could play the role of the lead that was really stewarding these projects through a pipeline. And this would be particularly important for these early projects where everybody is still in the learning mode.
When we were speaking earlier, we were talking about some of the pioneering purchasers, whether it's heavy industry who's reaching out to the projects in in Europe for capturing their emissions from steel or from cement. But I'm also reading about entities like Microsoft or Apple or Amazon looking at this technology. Why are they interested, and what are they actually doing in this area?
Mhm. Yeah, the tech companies have really for quite a long time been working on reducing their emissions. And, like many entities, the first thing you do is you look at, where you're getting electricity from, and you try to clean up your electricity. The next thing you maybe look at your heating. And like in the case of Stanford, what we decided to do was electrify our heating. But then when you look at your list of emissions, um, there's still a really long list, transportation, but there's also a tremendous amount of energy and carbon dioxide really embodied in all of the things that we purchase. So if you're a manufacturer, it's not only your direct emissions, like from electricity and heating and so forth. Every single thing that's in a product that you make has energy and embodied carbon dioxide emissions. So the tech companies who've made a lot of progress on their own emissions reductions now are looking to, well, how are they going to contribute to reducing the emissions of all the products that they use as part of their business? And and my sense is when they look at that and they realize that that directly going after those with the tools that they use to reduce their own emissions may not work. And so technologies like carbon capture and storage, people use a lot of concrete, people use a lot of paper, people use a lot of steel. Well, how can you get rid of those emissions associated with manufacturing those? Carbon dioxide capture and storage is a great way to do that. So I think they were just sort of highly evolved along the pathway, and as you eat away at your emissions, at some point you come to the realization that this is the best and most practical option available today. And then in the future, some companies and countries are starting to think about, well, gosh, I've had a lot of historical emissions in the past, and wouldn't it be great if I could also recapture some of those and remove them from the atmosphere? And then that's when you get into the net negative to try to reduce past emissions.
Got it. So, as I understand it, CCUS projects are still, as we would say in Boston, wicked expensive. Um, so, what are the prospects for if we're going to achieve the kind of scale we're talking about? We've got to start reducing the costs and of the commercial activity around this. Is this just a question of economies of scale that we're still in early stages of these technologies, and as we build them out, the costs are going to go down? Are we going to look for a cost curve or an experience curve as we saw in solar and wind, where we can think of an 80-90% reduction? What do you see as a prospect for that?
I guess I would quibble a little bit with you about it being expensive. That carbon capture and storage, probably will cost between $50 and $100 per ton of CO2 if you capture CO2 from a dilute source, like from a smokestack. And if we look at the cost of many other measures that have been taken, particularly in the early days, to start reducing carbon dioxide emissions, in particular renewables, battery storage, electric vehicles, the cost was much, much higher than that cost for CCS. So I, from the perspective of how to reduce emissions, carbon dioxide capture and storage isn't that expensive. But looked at in another way, it's expensive compared to unabated energy services. And if you have one product that doesn't have any capture and storage and another one with it, obviously it's going to be more expensive. And so in commodity markets, for example, like cement, it can be very challenging because who's going to buy your product even if it costs just 10% more. So that's an important issue. The other place that it's and here I would completely agree with you, wicked expensive, is that the capital investments needed to get a project going can be extremely high. They can be in the billions of dollars, and it's hard for anybody to aggregate that kind of capital, particularly for a new technology. So you know, I do think that the cost is going to come down. Estimates are that, or targets would be sort of a better way of saying it. Would be in the range of $30 a ton. Maybe, yeah. So I do think that costs will come down. I don't know that they're going to have like tenfold reduction or even hundred. Like if you look at solar photovoltaics, there's like 100-fold reduction over a 20-year period. I don't think that's going to happen. And there's been a tenfold reduction in cost over the past decade. Similarly with fuel cells, similarly with batteries. I don't think we're going to see a tenfold reduction, in part because the components that go into carbon capture and storage technologies are actually fairly well established. We have amine scrubbing to remove CO2 from, and that's a big process in natural gas cleanup, for example. And similarly with wells, we've drilled, millions and millions of wells. So I think it will come down some, but not, we won't see the dramatic reductions. But the economies of scale through things like hubs can really help. So if you build that base infrastructure once and then you incrementally add to it, that can help reduce costs. So yeah, I do think it will come down, but not as dramatically as some of the other technologies. But again, CCUS is starting from a baseline that is not particularly unaffordable from my perspective.
Now I get to ask about storage, which is your area of really being recognized as a worldwide expert on this. It's a topic, however, that often gets communities, people very scared. So from your perspective, looking at this for, as you said, over 20 years, what are the real risks and what are the things that are considered to be risks, but actually aren't that big a concern?
So just to sort of back up for a minute for all the audience, the basic idea behind CO2 storage is that you take compressed carbon dioxide, which is a liquid at the surface, and by the time you pump it underground, it's a supercritical fluid, and its density is about 2/3 of the density of the water. So it's buoyant. So when you put it underground, what you're going to be relying on is the presence of a type of rock formation that we would call a seal. And the seal is exactly like it sounds. It's a seal. It means that the CO2 can't escape. And seals are rocks, they're shale. It was very typically, or anhydrite salt would be another good one. So the basic physics and chemistry of CO2 storage, in underground formations is very, very well established. Through and built upon our understanding of why oil and gas formations actually accumulate where they do. From related disciplines like soil science and so forth. So the basic physics of this are really very, very well established. So then there's the question, it's like, okay, in nature, if you find the right place, it should work. So then there's the question as well, can we, create engineering infrastructure that allows us to safely put it in the rock under that seal? And again, here's another area where we have a lot of experience with drilling wells, and in particular injection wells, where you need to do an extra good job of making sure that the cement seal that connects the well to the rock around it is really good quality. But again, we can do that. We also have ways to measure, did we really do a good job? And all of that's required for a typical geologic storage project. So, in the right location, this is really very straightforward, and the risks are really very low. Um, there's always the possibility that, particularly when you go to an area with new type of rocks that you haven't studied, you haven't worked in that location, that, it takes a lot of work to characterize the rocks, to make sure that that seal is continuous and that you have a good reservoir and it's big enough. Now, this is something that geoscientists do all the time. Exploration geologists, this is their bread and butter. But it does take work, and it could be possible that you didn't there was something that you missed, which is why you need to monitor these projects. This is definitely not out of sight, out of mind. 20 years ago, I was talking to a reporter, and I thought I'd done such a nice job of describing to him what this was all about, and the headline came out: "Sweeping carbon dioxide under the rug." I was just mortified. So the point is that yeah, it's not sweeping it under the rug. You have to monitor it, and you have to show where it is. You have to show that it's not leaking. Again, those are technologies that we have available. So again, there are many assurances built into the process. You have to get permits in order to do this, and every year, as part of the permits, you have to report data to the government, showing that the project is complying. So when I talk with the public, there's often a concern it's going to leak back out into the atmosphere. Again, if you have a good site, that's not going to happen. And there have also been a lot of very detailed studies from my group and many others saying, okay, well, what if we did a really bad job and that there was, the seal wasn't as good as we thought it was? And if you look at the leakage rates under those circumstances, even where you have a poor seal, they're extremely low. They're on the order of, say, 1% per year. And again, if you had a leak anywhere near that big, it would be very clear from your monitoring data. So really, sort of no matter how you look at it, the risks are understood. There are government controls in place to oversee these projects, and even in the event that something does go wrong, there are many approaches you can use to basically remedy the situation. So yeah, that's the way I think about it.
Are there global standards around these kinds of issues? The risks and the monitoring frequency and the type of monitoring, have those evolved yet?
No, I would say that there is not sort of an international standard. There have been groups that have made some progress. ISO has done some work on this. The IPCC develops inventory guidelines. But the reality is, we see as policies are rolled out around the world that each country or each state might even have its own set of requirements. Now, some of that makes a lot of sense, right? Because every state has different geology. You have geological surveys who maybe have a lot of specialized knowledge and can help tailor to these regulations to make them efficient and effective. But as time goes on, we might see convergence around a more common set. Now, having said that, when we talk with the scientific community, the research community, like myself, there's been a lot of discussion about how often you might want to monitor, and that the idea that early in the injection process, that's when you'd want to have a very frequent monitoring, because that's going to tell you, did you do a really good job? You could detect leakage really early. But as time goes on, I think we all agree that less frequent monitoring would certainly suffice, because things are going to be changing slowly, and you've already sort of provided the proof that your site is good by your early monitoring data.
And just as a final question, is there sufficient storage in terms of geology around the world to really make a difference?
Oh, there's absolutely. Like, if you look at the total amount of CO2 that we would, really ever imagine storing on our pathway to getting net zero, compared to the size of the global storage resource, it's a very small fraction. So there's really not an issue about that. There is an issue about where these geologic storage resources are located. Just like oil and gas, they're not equally distributed around the globe. So the same is with those storage formations. So there may be some countries or regions of the world that really don't have good, at least onshore storage resources. In which case, we need to start thinking about global supply chains in taking emissions from where they are and transporting them, by ship or by pipeline to regions where there are really, top flight storage resources.
Excellent. So, Sally, you've been a geologist for a long time, but you've been in this area for, I think you said 23 years. So, how did you pick CCUS, and what compelled you to stay with the topic in the area, even as CCUS went through periods of, let's call it, unpopularity or doldrums
Mhm.
over the years?
Actually, in the late 1990s, I had been working on agricultural pollution and geothermal energy, and I decided it was time to sort of take a look. And it's like, okay, I'm moving on to another phase of my career. What do I want to devote my time to? And I began to study climate change, and I got extremely concerned that this was really a looming issue, and that we needed to find solutions. And I'm a hydrogeologist, right? I know how fluids flow through rocks, and it's like, well, I can't build a solar panel, and I'm not going to build a battery, but I could contribute to geologic storage. So it was really, motivated by, what can I do? What am I good at? And this huge need out there. So, I will really say it's been quite a ride. When I first started working on this, I literally thought that we would find every other solution to the climate change problem, and that CCS would be a backstop technology.
Uh-huh.
And that's how we're going to get to low value. Back then, we didn't even think you needed to get to zero. But then, the IPCC Special Report on Carbon Dioxide Capture and Storage came along, and all in 2005, and all of a sudden it's like, okay, let's go with CCS. But there was really no overarching climate policy, globally at that time that would motivate something of that ambition and scale. In the United States, we didn't have any policies that would apply. Uh, and so there was not the policy framework that would provide the financial tools that you need to make these investments. And then we had the global economic recession, and then the oil price dropped out of the bottom, and so it was sort of this perfect storm, and literally, it really slowed down tremendously. In the meantime, renewables, which had been expensive earlier, all of a sudden the costs were really dropping precipitously, and sort of the narrative became, well, gosh, we don't need CCS. It's going to be renewables all the way.
Right.
And then sort of reality sunk in that there are many, particularly these industrial emission sources, and getting reliable 24/7 electricity, that a renewables only approach was going to be very difficult. So I stuck with it because I really believed that this technology was a critical piece of solving the climate problem. I feel today more than ever that that hunch is being borne out, and really thrilled just to see the rapid new sort of resurgence of progress and interest in the area.
Sally, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been a really great conversation.
Thank you so much.
And listeners, thank you for joining us. Please visit our website, ogci.com, to learn more about the OGCI Members Global Kickstarter CCUS program, and on our work on low carbon industrial hubs, as well as looking at the CCUS projects and technology investments of OGCI Climate Investments, our billion-plus fund. Please join us on LinkedIn and on Twitter. You can follow us at OGCI News. And finally, thank you very much to our production team here at OGCI, our editor for this edition, Delia Methcone, our producer, Jason Dela Cruz. Thank you. Stay safe, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening.